If you consider the history of educational segregation in the U.S., you can see how the momentum built in the 1900s to start challenging segregation practices. It was not over after Brown v. Board in 1954, as de facto segregation still exists. When you consider that these challenges have been made over the past 130 plus years, and that Brown falls squarely in the middle of that time frame, and the issues that have been considered since then, you can understand that the issue is not just merely about access to schools, but access to resources. Thinking in broader terms than just access, one begins to understand that the issue is more about educational outcomes, and the resources needed to close the differences in those outcomes, notably the achievement gap. The achievement gap in education refers to the disparity in academic performances between groups of students. The achievement gap shows up in grades, standardized test scores, course selection, dropout rates, and college completion rates, among other success measures. It is most often used to describe the troubling performance gaps between African Americans and Hispanic students at the lower end of the performance scale and their non-Hispanic white peers, and the similar academic disparity between students from low-income families and those who are better off. The National Assessment of Education Progress is run by the U.S. Department of Education. It's a project that focuses on educational outcomes, and of the many different measures it conducts, it looks at racial disparity in achievement between whites and other minority groups, what is commonly referred to as achievement gaps. The gaps have a snowball effect in that once a youth is behind educationally, that tends to impact them down the road when they get to a higher level of classes, including college courses. Thus, minority students tend to underperform in college as well as in secondary schools. Schools with high non-white populations tend to share certain characteristics. When you consider that the majority of funding that a school receives comes from property taxes, you can see how school districts that have lower economic status will have less resources to spend on their students. The map supplied in your text helps illustrate that, with per-child spending rates for Palo Alto, California versus Linwood, California. There's a reason that an average home in the community is shown in the map. You can understand that the property value of the Palo Alto home is worth many hundreds of thousands more than the home illustrated in Linwood. When schools rely on community property taxes for funding, this is the kind of disparity of resources that occurs. There are well-intending individuals that believe that racial segregation in schools is much more beneficial than its opponents would realize. This has been in part the basis for much of the lawsuits shown on the previous slide from the 1970s and forward. Because of Brown, as well as other policy changes in the 1950s and 1960s, many white families moved from the cities to the suburbs in what is known as white flight. Because of this, and also somewhat in part to housing issues created by redlining, many of the suburban schools became predominantly white. Thus, schools were resegregated, what is known as de facto segregation. These schools, due to the unequal value of properties and homes and the difference in property taxes that were collected, then had, once again, unequal resources provided for the whites versus what was accessible in the predominantly minority schools. Some argue that segregated schools have a positive effect on non-white students, in that they are more comfortable when they are not seen as the minority student in the class and don't have to deal with whiteness as the norm in their everyday interactions. However, the majority of studies show that all, not just the non-white, but the white students too, benefit from integration, and that segregation appears to be overwhelmingly detrimental to students. Achievement gaps seem to occur even when policies attempt to equalize resources. In order to fully understand it, we have to understand the social, cultural, curricular, and political dimensions, and that while children learn their cultural identities to some extent at home, they also develop their identities at school as well. The student generally has a home life that is familiar to them, But when they attend school, they are put in an environment where people may be different from what they experience at home. We also know that schools have expectations for students. Some students are steered towards honors courses. Some students are steered towards less challenging academic courses or vocational courses. Some teachers also have different expectation levels of their students' work. Some want to challenge only those students who think they show exceptional academic ability, while allowing others to just get by. Students often respond to their teachers' expectation levels, and this can lead to some students being underperformers.